Welcome everybody to the 8th lecture of our book talk series, Spatial Practices in Chinese Art, History, and Visual Studies, organized by the Department of Chinese Culture at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. My name is Kathleen Mack. I'm a host and an organizer of this book talk series. Joining me organizing and hosting the talk today is my colleague, Dr. Pan Lu, Associate Professor specializing in Cultural Studies, also from the Chinese Culture Department. For those of us who have been with us for the past few months, many of you know that Lu and I had the idea of organizing this book talk series for two major reasons. First, both of us are interested in the role of space as opposed to time, not only as a historical question, but also as a methodological approach to investigate issues in art history and visual studies. Second, both of us are interested in making use of the technology of video conferencing to create an alternative platform where specialists and friends interested in the issue can get together to discuss relevant problems and also learn about latest publications in the field. Today is our great honor to have Professor Juliane Noth of the Institute of Art History at the Freie Universität Berlin, hope that I pronounced it correct, to present to us her new book, Transmedial Landscapes and Modern Chinese Painting, published by the Harvard University Asia Center this year, 2022. Indeed, the book now is in print, and then we will be able to see it in bookstore, get it online, I think starting from July this year. So let us welcome our speaker, Professor Noth.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for the introduction, and thank you, Kathy and Pan Lu, for inviting me. Let me share my screen. Now it should work. So yes, I'm really very honored to be part of this book talk series, because I think it fits really very well with the topics I'm treating in my book, Transmedial Landscapes in Modern Chinese Painting. And my editor just told me that the first box was delivered to her office, but it will be available to US customers from July and to customers outside North America, maybe beginning in August. So yes, it's still a bit to go, but yeah, I hope I can rouse your interest in my book through this talk. I call it Transmedial Landscapes in Modern Chinese Painting because I'm looking at how artists in Republican China and in the early to mid 1930s in particular used relatively new media like pencil sketching, ink sketching, photography, notions like drawing from life, or also social Darwinist ways of thinking to rethink ink painting, or what was by then called national painting, or guohua. They also engage with other traditional media, such as woodblock printing. So if we very closely look at the works, we can see how they engage with these other media and how they used these the qualities or the visuality of these other media in guohua, and how this eventually very profoundly changed guohua, and how this shaped what we now understand as modern Chinese ink painting. And to describe these engagements, I used the term a transmedial practice, which I kind of borrowed from Lydia Liu's translingual practice, to combine the idea of cultural translation and the reinterpretation, reinvention of concepts, of ideas, of techniques in the host language or in the host medium, and the notion of transmediality, that is the engagement with one particular medium and its specific media qualities in another medium. So for example, the visual qualities or the visuality of photography and how this was referred to in the medium of ink painting. So this is how the title came about. And the practices, or these transmedial practices, were very, very much very closely combined with spatial practices by these artists, and through travel, and not only private travel or private excursions to beautiful landscapes for outdoor sketching, which has been described also very intensely by Gu Yi or Yi Gu in her book, and but also in government-sponsored tours that sent the artists on the road and had them create artworks to praise newly built railroads, newly built highways, and foster tourism. So these are the phenomena that my book is about. And I'm looking at two publications in particular where these phenomena were described or took shape in a very concentrated way. So one is the publication or the journal Guohua or National Painting Monthly, which was published by the Chinese Painting Society, and where the issues of how to reinterpret Chinese painting, or how to deal with the legacy of Chinese painting, was very intensely discussed, and most intensely perhaps in the 4th and 5th issues, which were issued as a special issue on the ideas of landscape painting in China and the West. So there the editors really aimed to compare the strengths and the weaknesses of landscape painting in China and the West, and in order to reassess the strengths of Chinese landscape painting. Another book I'm very closely looking into is a very beautiful publication called Dongnan Lansheng, or it has the English title In Search of the Southeast. And this was a book sponsored by the Nanjing government, and was published to publish the results of the so-called Southeastern Infrastructure Tour. And so it was really a book, a very beautifully printed, very expensive book that didn't assemble. It was actually not about technology, as we could think from the cover image of the Tiantang River Bridge that was under construction between 1934 and 1937. But it's actually mostly poetry, travelogues, and landscape photography, and also to a lesser degree landscape painting. So it was actually quite traditional media and traditional formats that were brought together in this book to promote newly built roads that were built over the course of the year 1934. I'm also looking at the careers and the works of 3 artists who were all 3 of them were involved in Guohua Yuekan, and all 3 of them were also involved in Dongnan Lansheng. So they were really closely cooperating and good friends in Shanghai in the 1930s. So I think every one of you is very familiar with the work of Huang Minhong, who was then already a very senior artist, but who really socialized with a younger generation of artists, and was actively involved in all these activities. He Tianjian was a self-taught artist who practiced, who praised himself for being able to paint in any style, and who painted in a great variety of different styles. and who also wrote many poems for Dongnan Lansheng, and also he was the main editor of Guohua Yuekan. And Yu Jianhua is today better known as an art historian, which was his main career after 1949. But in 1930s Shanghai, he was someone who had originally started watercolor and technical drawing in Beijing and a bit of Guohua and under Chen Shizeng, and then came to Shanghai and entered the Guohua circles there. And he was a very avid traveler, and also during his times at the art college in Beijing, he had published travel accounts about his sketching tours. And in the mid-1930s, he produced 3 hand-painted, handwritten travel manuscripts as string-bound books, which were in which he engaged with the imagery of the Southeastern Infrastructure Tour and other regions of Zhejiang and Southeastern China. So these are the protagonists of my book, and very briefly, this is the contents. So my first chapter is about National Painting Monthly, and especially the special issue on the ideas of landscape painting in China and the West. Then I have a chapter on the paintings of He Tianjian and how he reinterpreted the canon of Chinese painting, and how place and spatial practices informed and shaped his own painting. And then I have a chapter on the book In Search of the Southeast, or Dongnan Lansheng, where I analyze the editorial strategies and how Dongnan Lansheng was part of a very broad array of travel-related publications in 1930s Shanghai and Hangzhou, and how it formed a special way of presenting travel. Then I have a chapter on Yu Jianhua's travel albums that I just mentioned, and in chapter 5, this is a chapter I myself consider is very important for the whole book, but it's something that came as a rather late point, because there's one chapter in Dongnan Lansheng which is devoted to Huangshan, or to Mount Huang. And then I realized that the whole the publication activities and the artistic practices clustering around Huangshan, and the way how Huangshan really became became an icon of Chinese landscape and Chinese painting, really was started with those publication activities, of which In Search of the Southeast was part, but then it outgrew the scope of In Search of Southeast. So I decided to devote an entire chapter to this process. And the longest chapter of my book is on Huang Binhong, which is partly due to the importance of Huang Binhong as an artist. So this is also, he's the person I started the whole project with. So it kind of developed out of an interest in Huang Binhong and questions of how his place-related paintings and his discussions of ink practices and Bimoor or brush technique were related, and how his later painting could be understood from his earlier paintings. And it was really through going through his biography and trying to find his early works, many of which are now lost and only retrievable through Republican period publications, that I came to realize the complexity of the transmedial practices and the role of travel in these practices. Yeah, and then I have a very brief epilogue on how the artists that I discuss in my book transitioned, or how they experienced the times of the Sino-Japanese War, and how this influenced their painting, with a very brief outlook into after 1949. So this just as a brief overview. And because of the topic of this book talk series with the special practices, I will really focus on those aspects, on the spatial practices that I discuss in the book. So I won't be talking about chapter 1 and the issues of canonization or reinterpretation of the canon of Chinese painting and Chinese painting history. So here is again the cover of In Search of the Southeast, and some of the contributions of He Tianjian, Huang Binhong, and Ju Jianhua to this book. So He Tianjian had an article called Record of Verifying the Landscape of Eastern Zhejiang in Painting, in which he discussed his experience in traveling along the newly built Zhejiang-Jiangxi Railway and on the Fuchun River, and he described the landscape through a set of brush techniques, or as if the landscape was a painting. So it's really about kind of reinterpreting the landscape and finding a way, translating the landscape and the description of landscape into painting. And as I said, he also has many poems in the book. Huang Binhong didn't participate in the travels, but he wrote a very long article called An Analytical Tour of Huangshan, because Huangshan was his native place. So he has this lifelong involvement with the history of Huangshan. And this is also a very interesting text, because he kind of uses the structure of traditional mountain gazetteers like the Huangshan Zhi. And so the chapter structures at first sight looks like the chapter structure of a traditional gazetteer, but then it's actually, he's taking us on tours across Huangshan. So each chapter is a tour in itself, focusing on different aspects. So one chapter is more on the landscapes, one chapter is more on the buildings, also the non-extant buildings, because not so many buildings were left in the 1930s. And also he gives a very full overview on paintings on Huangshan. So it has also an art historical component. And Yu Jianhua was part of the tour group that traveled on the Hangzhou-Fuzhou highway into the direction of Yandangshan, and contributed several texts, also on a visit to Tiantai, Mount Tiantai. So this is a map of Zhejiang and the surrounding provinces from the book In Search of the Southeast. So it's just called a map of the tour routes of the Southeastern Infrastructure Tour, and it centers all on Hangzhou. So Hangzhou is here. And several roads were built in 1934 to connect Zhejiang with the adjacent provinces. So there was the Hangzhou-Huizhou rail highway, there was the Nanjing-Hangzhou highway, the Hangzhou-Fuzhou highway, and most prominently the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Railway, which was first started as the so-called Hangzhou-Jiangshan railway, and then was step for step was extended into Jiangxi until it reached Nanchang. And at the time of the publication of the book, it had extended until Yushan and hadn't reached Nanchang by then. And so those writers and artists and intellectuals were invited to travel on these routes and to write the travelogues and the poems, and for example also a group of famous photographers who were the editors of the most important Shanghai illustrated journals were collectively invited to travel to Huangshan and make photographs of Huangshan. And we can see that the routes initially were circular, but then the chapter structure of the book is really organized in a linear fashion. So it's along the Hangzhou-Huizhou Highway, along the Nanjing-Hangzhou Highway, and so on and so on. Besides these invited contributions to the book, the Hangzhou Railway Authority, so the whole project took shape under the auspices of the Zhejiang Province Reconstruction Bureau, and they also organized an exhibition in Shanghai with 4 categories. So it was ink painting, oil painting, photography, and literature. And they also gave prizes to the most successful paintings or artworks, and some of these were also reproduced in the book In Search of the Southeast. And here we have a view into the Guohua section of the exhibition, and this work here was also reproduced in Dongnan Lansheng. Yeah, I want to use this slide to show you how Dongnan Lansheng was part of a very broad aim or activity in the nationalist government, but also in the Shanghai media world, to not only to travel and to promote travel, but also to document the landscapes of China and to kind of find representative views of the most representative landscapes of China. So what you see here in the middle is one of several very large and heavy books published by the Liangyou, by the editors of the illustrated magazine of the pictorial Liangyou, or the Good Companion, the Young Companion, which they published in the early and to mid 1930s, and this one has the English name China as She Is, or in Chinese 中华景象. And so this is they sent a group of photographers through all provinces of China, and so this book is and they continuously reported on these travels in the pictorial Liangyou. And then for this book they selected on the average 1 page per famous site to represent images of what we could say the must-see landscapes of China, and it's ordered according to provinces. So what we see here is 2 pages from the chapter on Zhejiang province. So we have here the Fuchun River and the Qililong Gorge on the Qiantang River. And so Qiantang River is actually the same river as the Fuchun River, but a name change in between. And here is this famous fishing terrace of Yanziling. And the same, so this was one very iconic motif that was very much photographed in early 20th century China, and which we can also see here in these two photographs reproduced in Dongnan Lansheng. And here on the other side we have Xianxialing or Xianxiaguan. So this is a mountain range on the border between Zhejiang province, Fujian province, and Jiangxi province, and which was also a very contested site during the Fujian Rebellion of 1933. As the caption in China as She Is states, we actually have sandbags stacked here. There's barbed wire across the stream here, and soldiers are on patrol here on this bridge. And the same photograph was also reproduced in Dongnan Lansheng, but no reference was made to the conflict that is documented in this photograph. So the particular strategy of Dongnan Lansheng in comparison to other travel-related books from this time is quite exceptional, in that texts and images by different authors are used to create a continuous narrative of travel along the designated routes of the Southeastern Infrastructure Tour. So the tour, these artists not necessarily really traveled along these tours, along these routes together or at the same time, but through the, we could say, cut and paste of the editors of Dongnan Lansheng, we have this kind of collective impression of collective travel, of collective experience, and collective viewing of the Zhejiang landscapes, and the reflection in poetry and travelogues and in landscape images. So we as readers or viewers can have the feeling that we're embarking on the same travel together with these poets and photographers. For example, the text by Yu Dafu, which is accompanying the photograph of Xianxiaguan here, it was actually written in 1933, and it was first published for a very, in a way, similar book, a book called Zhedong Jingwu Ji, so Scenic Views of Eastern Zhejiang, and which was conceived as a travel guide to the then still called Hangzhou-Jiangshan Railway. So the new railroad was built and was about to open, and then the railway authorities asked Yu Dafu and other authors to write texts for this particular book in 1933, and then Yu Dafu's text was reprinted 2 years later in Search of the Southeast. And it was also printed in Shenbao, so in the newspaper, and in the newspaper version, Yu Dafu very explicitly refers to the Fujian Rebellion and to visiting the village depicted down here, which is called Arshibadu, and that it was deserted, and that only very few villagers were there and didn't speak to them, and then that a soldier said something about rumors about a rebellion. So there's this very compelling and scary account of encountering the traces of the conflict, but this part of the account was taken out for the official publications that were published by the state authorities. So In Search of the Southeast, as well as the earlier Scenic Views of Eastern Zhejiang, both did not contain this reference. Only the image of the bridge is still remains as a trace of this conflict of the Fujian Rebellion. And here we can see how the imagery of photographs and other images published in Dongnan Lanzheng then engendered other images, or how artists used them and cited them. For example, we have here the a painting by He Tianjian, painted in 1935, and called Nye Lanxi or Jin Lanxi, and where he describes traveling through the 7 Mile Gorge or Qililong. And so if we just look at the painting by only the painting itself, we could think that this is maybe He Tianjian's own impression of the site, and a very strange spatial arrangement of this kind of dissolving mountain in the background, which is not clear whether it's extending backward or forward, or how the spatial relation between the cliff in the foreground and this mountainside in the background is kind of awkward and unresolved. But when we look at this photograph by Ren Mei in Search of the Southeast, and it's a photograph printed next to one of He Tianjian's own poems, we can see that he actually very closely cited the visual impression of the photograph, and the very hazy mountainside in the background that is blurred by lensed optics, and the contrast between the very highly defined Yanziling in or the fishing terrace of Yanziling in the foreground, and this pale mountainside in the background, including the pine tree hanging over the cliff. It's all in the photograph, and He Tianjian translated this composition from the photograph into a painting, which doesn't mean that it's a copy of this photograph, but it's a reappropriation of the specific photographic visuality, and a translation into the medium of painting. And also, this painting by He Tianjian is even more programmatic, because it illustrates his long article on proving the landscape of verifying the landscape of Eastern Zhejiang in painting, and also the long inscription that you see up here is also part of his essay. So the text is more or less identical. What he depicts here is a site that was a kind of must go for all travelers along the Zhejiang-Jiangxi railway. So Zhuji was one of the stops on the railway, and it was once a station which was mentioned in every travelogue related to the railway. So the 5 falls or wuxie of Zhuji were the main scenic site there, so all the visitors would have to go there. But of those 5 falls, the 4th fall was the most inaccessible. So He Tianjian describes that he and the railroad engineer and photographer Zhong Shirong were the only ones who dared to climb the cliffs, and to so here we can see them clinging here, sitting in the cliffs, looking down on the 4th cataract, or the 4th fall, falling down here. And yes, from this, so it was something that afforded a lot of courage to go and see. And he also writes that he had to paint it because it would be impossible to take a photograph of the place unless one would be a fairy or an immortal, and could fly and take a photograph from mid-air. So what he does not mention is that actually Chen Wanli, one of the major Republican period landscape photographers, had taken a photograph of this fourth fall and published in the anthology Scenic Sites in Eastern Zhejiang, the same anthology where Yu Dafu had published his essay in 1933. So it's actually in a forerunner publication of In Search of the Southeast. So we can definitely assume that He Tiandian very well knew Chen Wanli's photograph, and I think the fact that he knew this photograph is also reflected in the composition of his painting. So he imitates the composition of the photograph to make a statement that the site could not be photographed. So he negates his source to make an argument about the possibilities and the abilities of painting in contrast to photography. And this is quite typical of much of the rhetoric of these painters, or also the rhetoric of their works, that it's kind of a competition between photography and painting about the possibilities and the ways how the respective media could represent a Chinese landscape. And the basic argument by the landscape painters was, of course, that with traditional Chinese painting methods, one could much better represent Chinese landscape. So this is one of the first of the 3 travel albums by Yu Jianhua that I mentioned. And it also starts with so it's actually the first chapter is about his visit to Zhuji and to the 5 falls. And so it's really, he is re-traveling along the tracks of the route along the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Railway, and we can see in many of his illustrations how he reinterprets or how he engages with images reproduced in Search of the Southeast, and engages in a kind of visual dialogue and superseding the visuality of photography through painting. So here he very deliberately, so here he starts from below with the 5th fall, and then the 4th fall, which is the one. So here we again have 2 visitors sitting perched on a cliff and gazing down at this very steep waterfall. And here we have them again, but now we have the 3rd fall above and the 4th fall below. So it's a combination of the 3rd and 4th. And here we have the 1st and 2nd falls, which are the highest. And so what we have here is a kind of not only going from one fall to the next, but also in the combination of these 2 illustrations of the 4th and the 3rd, a kind of effect of zooming in, and also adapting the very slim format of the hanging scroll to squeeze to combine two sides into one elongated composition that would not be possible in photography. So it's a very decisively non-photographic way of representing these falls that Yu Jianhua is using here. Whereas I think in his depiction of the first and second falls, in this not really monochromatic, but in the use of ochre, black and white paper, a reference to sepia colored photographs, and here he really creates the effect of a black and white photograph in ink painting. And yes, I think in the beginning I briefly mentioned that these travel albums, which are bound as spring-bound books, are completely handwritten and hand-painted. So it's really it's originals that he kept with himself for his entire life, and he was later part of the faculty at the Nanjing University of the Arts. So now they are in the collection of the library in Nanjing now. And regarding the layout of his first album, so it's called Record of Further Travels in Eastern Zhejiang, is that he actually played with the layout of travelogues and travel publications of the time, and very likely one of his own early publications a few years earlier in 1932 in Lü Xing Zazhi, the China Traveler, of his travel record of traveling to Mount Yandang or Yandangshan, and which was published in 4 installments. And so it was the texts accompanied or illustrated with his own, with illustrations taken from a set of albums that he created during his sojourn on Yandangshan. But what I'm trying to show you here is that in his handwritten manuscript, he actually imitated the layout of the journal article with the headings, with the author name, and the inserted illustration and page numbers, etc. So this is also a way of translating the mediality of the print publication into this handwritten manuscript and hand-painted manuscript. Huang Minhong traveled to Yandangshan too, and this is a case where we can really trace how he encountered the landscape, and he also kept a travel diary, which is published in his collected works, and it's also a motif that he reused many times later on. So there's several paintings right into the 50s that refer back to his visit to Yandangshan in 1931. So on site, he painted a set of pencil sketches with a purple color pencil on a paper that has now turned yellow. So it's a sized paper and it's quite small in size. And so there's a series of sketches, and one can really trace how he moved through the mountain with these sketches. And in some instances, we can also see the raindrops or maybe the waterfall drops that's blurred, like here. There's probably raindrops blurring the lines of the pencil on the paper. And yeah, I mean, the seal is the seal of the Zhejiang Boyuguan, of the Zhejiang Provincial Museum. And on the left side, I'm showing you his realization or his use of the sketch in a more complete picture, but which is not a painting, but one of the images in a woodblock printed album that is in itself very fascinating, because it was a present for him by his friends and students for his 70th birthday. So they presented this woodblock printed album to him, but he actually made it. So he made the images, and they were cut in wood and printed as woodblock prints. And it's again travel. We can again follow his travel routes through the images depicted here, as we can see. So this is number 3 of Mount Yendang, and there's also several images of Huangshan, several images of his travels in Sichuan, and several images of his travels in Guangdong and Guangxi. So it's really place related, and within each place there's a series of images. And so we can see here an image that is based on very clearly based on the pencil sketch. So we have here this peculiar mountain shape that seems to be toppling and hanging over, which we can see here in a slightly less dangerous looking fashion. And we have here the temple and the outlines of the stream in front of the temple, which we can again see here. And the temple is here. So we can really see how he transformed the sketch into a more complete and more a formal image, and an image that, of course, with these in this woodblock printed format seems to refer to pre-modern woodblock printed images in such Ming Dynasty publications like Haine Qiguan or Mingshan Tu. Where we have very refined landscape woodblock prints, and also with the whole arrangement, he seems to cite these pre-modern woodblock prints. But what is a major difference here is that Huang Binghong's own handwriting and his own very distinctive brush mode are copied from painting into woodblock print. So it's not only about his personal experience of the site, but also a translation of his personal painting style and his personal hand into the medium of woodblock. So we have this kind of vice versa translation from painting into woodblock and back again, maybe. And this is something of an afterthought, but I think it's very important when we think about Huang Binghong, that I think the common image of Huang Binghong is that he was a very modernist looking painter, but somehow a conservative, who was always engaging with ancient painting, and who kind of compared himself to the old masters, or who cited the old masters and transformed their styles. And that even if he went out to sketch from nature, he digested the views of nature into something that was basically about brushwork and engagement with ancient masters. But what I found out while looking through his images and landscape sketches, such as the one I'm showing you here on the right side, which is just commonly labeled as landscape sketched after nature, is that he digested many sources and woodblock prints from ancient gazetteers, for example, from the Wuishan Gazetteer or from the Huangshan Gazetteer, and but also works by younger artists. So here on the left, I'm showing you an illustration from another of Yu Jianhua's travel albums, which was one he undertook of a travel he undertook in 1936 along the Zhejiang-Jiangxi railway into Jiangxi. So this is a site in Jiangxi, and where Huang Minhong himself did not go, but actually this whole set of sketches, which is labeled Landscape Sketches After Nature, is based on Yu Jianhua's album. So it's apparently Huang Minhong took time, maybe borrowed this album from Yu Jianhua, for which he also wrote a colophon, and copied several of the images, and of course in style and the whole composition turns into something entirely different. But it's still based on Yu Jianhua's image, and then Huang Minhong translates it in something that is more about the relationships of shapes, of painted and unpainted areas, and of brushwork, than about depicting the actual site at Qijian Cliff. Yeah, so finally, I want to very briefly talk about the Huangshan, the role of Huangshan in this whole spatial and transmedial transfiguration of modern Chinese painting. And in the beginning, I already mentioned that so that this kind of reconstruction and reconfiguration of Huangshan began, or was part of the flurry of activities surrounding the so-called Southeastern Infrastructure Tour, but that it quickly outgrew the whole thing. So Xu Shiying, who was the editor of the book I'm showing you here, was an Anhui native, and he was the head of the relief, Natural Disaster Relief Commission, and he organized a Huangshan Reconstruction Commission and invested. So the buildings you see up here, these are buildings that were built in 1934 by the Huangshan Reconstruction Commission, and he established, together with China Travel Service, a modern hotel at the foot of the mountain, and a bus connection from Hangzhou to Shexian. And so it's just as also a means of economic reconstruction of this quite impoverished region around Huangshan. They cleared the path and the roads up the mountain, and had stone steps cut into the mountain. And so it was in the early 1930s, travelers still had to bring their own bedding and water cans and food. And by 1934, it was really established as a travel destination with around 1,000 visitors coming per month, and the possibility to travel there from Shanghai and to spend an extended weekend on Huangshan. Politicians and artists founded a society called the Huangshe, or the Huangshan Society, or Yellow Society, and they organized an exhibition that first was shown in Shanghai, then in Hangzhou and Nanjing, around December and January 1934-35, and then traveled on to Singapore to collect money for this reconstruction efforts. And what we can also see here from these images here, which are a double spread from Liang You, with works shown in an exhibition of the Huangshe. is that the quality of photography or the easiness with which photography could be reproduced in a pictorial, and how the photographic image superseded ink painting in representing Huangshan. And if we look at the photographs, there's actually a very, very clear mode of photography. So it's mostly pine tree in the foreground, mountain cliff in the background, and some are more like splashed ink landscapes in black and white, and some are more focused on the structure of the mountain and of the trees. But it's always this foreground, middle ground, empty middle ground, background, and it's either the foreground in sharp focus and the background out of focus, or the other way around. And what also happened in the context of this of the photographic capturing of Huangshan, or the documentation and the shaping of a photographic Huangshan imagery, is that a particular pine tree became the iconic pine tree of Huangshan. And this is the pine tree that you see on the cover of this book, Huangshan Lanchengji, which is Yingkesung, or the guest greeting pine. And Yingkesung seems to have several very photogenic properties, and that is, first of all, it was close to the route leading up the mountain. So whoever climbed the mountain would pass by the pine tree, and it could be captured with more or less in focus, and also with the background in focus. So it had this ideal distance to be completely seized within the frame, and having the pine tree plus cliff in the background combination in a very ideal way. And it's also always taken from the same angle, more or less, as we can see here in photographs by 3 famous artists, photographers, who traveled to Huangshan together in 1934 for the Southeastern Infrastructure Tour. So we can see how similar all the photographs are, and how recognizable this pine tree is. So it's really through this repeated representation in photographs that the guest greeting pine became the icon of Huangshan. And this is in very stark contrast to the tree that used to be the icon of Huangshan in pre-modern times, which was a tree called the tamed dragon pine, or Raolongsun, which is most iconically represented here in this album leaf by Hongren, and Hongren's leaf was copied also in woodblock prints and in album by Shitao. So it was kind of also the starting point of an iconographic tradition centering around this very peculiar tree that was winding downward around this rock needle. The problem with the tamed dragon pine was that it's relatively inaccessible, so it could not be captured in photography. So once photography became the main medium of the representation of Huangshan, the Raolongsun, or the tamed dragon pine, kind of dropped out of the repertoire of Huangshan imagery, and was replaced by Yingkesung, which was actually only named in the 19th century. So the Yingkesung, or guest greeting pine, is a very young pine tree comparably. And by the way, the tamed dragon pine is has withered by now, is no longer there, whereas the guest greeting pine is still flourishing. So it's no wonder that in the third of Juliane Noth's illustrated albums of travel albums, which is almost completely dedicated to Huangshan, he has one image of the tame dragon pine, but he has 3 images of the guest greeting pine, and one of these is almost exactly based on the photographic representations by his photographer colleagues who had traveled there in 1934. So, and here these cross and transmedial references that shaped not only photography that imitated painting, but also painting engaging with the means of photography is very very densely connected, and this is why I chose this image as the cover of my book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliane, so much for this really fascinating talk. I think this is the last talk, probably the last or the second last talk in our season, but I see this connection between your talk with, for example, the talk in our last season by Professor Gu Yi, and also my own talk, I think, when I talked about Liu Haisu's painting of Sihang Warehouse and its photography. So I see a lot of interesting linkage between your topic and you know, other people in the series. So I'm very happy about that. So I have 2 questions. The first question, maybe I'm a little bit less familiar with this entire practice of landscape painting of that particular time period. So I'm very I'm curious to know why in that year or during, you know, that period of time, these artists are so eager to do this collective, either collective or seemingly collective infrastructure tour, which I found very, very interesting. And to this particular part of China, to look for this, as you said, the representative landscape of China. So, so this question maybe wants you to elaborate a little bit about the context of why at that time and why this particular area, because I think there might be some reason behind. So I would like to know about that, because I think this landscape also has a lot to do with, for example, the identity building of a particular, you know, for example, the Republic of China, or, you know, or even among the artists themselves. So I want you to elaborate a little bit about the context. The second question is, from what you said, I found it seems to me, at least in the works or the cases you analyzed about all these individual artists, it seems to me that as you said, this close relationship between a similar landscape across different media, it seems to me very smooth, this smooth merging or mutual copying of the style, the composition of these similar landscape on different media. I'm not sure if was there any kind of controversy among them, or they just accepted it really openly, because I would say, you know, for example, photography might play a more important role in the in recalling a kind of authenticity in how we look at a reality. So, but it seems to me that the cases you mentioned, that it's all very smoothly merged or accepted. So I was wondering if there was any kind of question or controversies or resistance to that kind of merging, and was these kind of merging a more kind of personal experiment in you know, these artistic practices of these artists, or you find a larger reason or motivation behind of this kind of transmedial practices? For example, you mentioned the publication of these photos side by side with these paintings on Liangyou in such mass media. So I was just wondering some kind of commercial trends or commercial kind of purpose behind. So I just want to know a little bit more about how this, you know, transmedial practice were received, and also you know, what was the larger motivation behind that. That was the two of my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's big questions, and maybe more than two. So maybe to the political context first, and I mean, why they were so eager to participate. I can't say why they were eager to. I mean, the political context is certainly one of nation building. So if we look at this Southeastern infrastructure tour, which was actually first a road building campaign, and then it was a PR campaign to promote these new roads. So it was first to press on a swift building campaign, just to get these highways built within a few months. And then the plan was to invite diplomats and businessmen to travel on this designated tour, and then sell the tour to tourists. So it was this very highbrow kind of luxurious vacation or tour format that was designed to promote the newly built infrastructure to businessmen and also foreign diplomats. And this part of the tour was never realized because there was a drought in Anhui, so it was mainly cancelled for financial reasons. And the only thing that materialized was the tours taken by the artists to propagate it. So some artists traveled by themselves, I think. So those artists who submitted paintings to the exhibition in July 1934, and many artists really traveled who were invited by the Zhejiang government. But it was actually Jiang Jieshi who was the mastermind behind the whole thing. And so the head of the Zhejiang Construction Bureau was also a close associate of him. So the provinces that are covered. So Zhejiang is of course also Jiang Jieshi's home province, and then also the surrounding areas were actually the only areas of China where the national government had firm control. So beyond those 5 southeastern provinces, the hold was very tenuous because you had all those warlords in Guangdong, Guangxi, and you had the Fujian rebellion, and Sichuan was problematic, the whole north was problematic, and so on. So this was really the core of nationalist China that was kind of developed here. And one of the imperatives of building these roads was not only economic development, but also the speedy deployment of troops. So that the Fujian rebellion was quelled so quickly was also part due to the fact that the troops were moved to the Fujian border with the railway. So it played a very crucial role. And also the threats by Japan of the Japanese invasions also, and the communist Soviet and the Jiangxi Soviet is always mentioned in the speeches connected to this road building campaign. So the Dongnan Lansheng, this book, and all those travelogues and beautiful pictures that show nothing of these that seem to be purely aesthetic and or in some cases scientific. So we have one piece by a famous geographer, and we have one piece on medicinal herbs in, and so it's kind of the beautiful side to those very practical considerations. Yeah, and yeah, I didn't mention that actually the calligraphy of, when I go back to Dongnan Lansheng, the title calligraphy was written by Zhang Jieshi. So it's really very highbrow. So I think it was, yeah, so maybe it was also an honor for these artists to be involved in such a government project. I think it was also an opportunity, of course, for them to travel, because traveling and painting from nature had become such an important point in aspects of, in discourses of how to modernize Guohua. So this has a lot to do with, you know, what Gu Yi has described in her book, the adaptation of painting from nature as something that was first regarded as the epitome of Western practices, but which was then also projected back into the past. So to say that the painters of the Tang and Song dynasties all painted from nature, and the decline of Chinese painting is only because later on they didn't paint from nature anymore, but kept copying the Tang and Song masters. So only if we go back and do it the same way that the Tang and Song masters did, and retrieve the sources of our painting methods in the landscape. So that's why also He Tianjian's essay is called Verifying the Landscape in Painting. It's not only verifying the methods in painting, but verifying that the landscape is actually like the painting. So it's actually truer, or as true as photography. So, and this is where this the conflict maybe, or the controversy that you mentioned, or that you asked about, comes in. So it's really about this. I mean, especially when you look at what I didn't talk about today, about the articles in Guohua Yuekan, it's really about the survival of Chinese culture, of Chinese painting, and to have a reason for its existence, a raison d'être. And so it's really this kind of competition with other media, and the drive to prove that Chinese painting is at least as valuable, if not more valuable, in depicting Chinese themes and Chinese landscapes than photography. So also when they cite photography, as for example, He Tianjian does, or I mean here, or also by in Yu Jianhua, it's very obvious that he kind of uses photographs and, you know, cites them in his paintings, but then makes the citation invisible. So they deny the citations. So it's not like they say, okay, look, I'm citing this photograph, but I'm doing it in a better way. But it's really like they cite the photographs, but they pretend this to be true painting, or, you know, they frame it in the discourse of painting. And that's very different from photographers, because photographers say, look, we're doing photographs, but we're imitating Chinese painting. and how can we make our photographs look like Chinese painting? And this here also when we look at those Huangshan photographs, sorry, I'm switching back and forth, but if we look at, this is a Lang Jingshan photograph up here, and we have several photographs that really have this very strong black and white contrast that is kind of reminiscent, and which was also by the photographers described as referring to splashed ink paintings, or to Ma Yuan and Southern Sung painting. And so they sought out those painting modes that could be imitated with photography. So with photography, you possibly can't imitate brush technique or brushwork, but of course you can imitate the effects of splashed ink. And so it's the reinvention of, or also the rediscovery of splashed ink painting from Japan. So this, lost Chinese tradition that was rediscovered via Japan, and then was kind of adopted by the photographers and projected onto a mountain like Huangshan, and became formative for Huangshan imagery. Whereas when we look at traditional Huangshan painting, it's very linear and very, very sparse use of ink. If we look at Hongren or Shitao or Davenxiao, it's not splashed ink painting, but it's the opposite. But the modern imagery of Huangshan became this kind of black and white contrasts.
Very interesting, this, multi-directional kind of rediscoveries and reinvention. Yeah. Great, thank you so much. Maybe Kathy have a question, and for the audience, if you have any question, feel free to type it in the chat box.
Okay, thank you, Professor Noth, for your very inspiring presentation. I enjoyed a lot because it did give me a more different perspective to rethink relationship between landscape painting and photography, and also poetry, indeed, you mentioned as well. And then your presentation also add on new ideas, because I read an article written by Patty Chan, also touched up on this state-sponsored painting project in the Republican Bureau as well, but you talk a lot more about the transmedial practice. So one question I have here is that what about the editorial work? Because it seems that the editor also played a very important role in creating an impressions of the interconnection between painting and photograph. So I was wondering who were the editors, and what kind of dynamics you were able to observe when the editors put together these different aspects of cultural production together into a catalog. And the second question is that whether the state, the Republican government, had any offered any guidance to the artists or photographers when they arranged them to different locations for portraying, for instance, any political discourses or slogan, apart from what you have mentioned, the interest to modernize Guohua Chinese painting and the threats felt by the artists regarding the survival of Chinese painting and culture.
So I didn't make notes, so I realized I kind of forgot what your first question was. So maybe I start with the second question. So as for the directives, Yu Dafu, he mentions when a person from the Hangzhou Railway Bureau approached him to travel along on the railroad and write a travelogue, he said, yeah, they want to, so it's almost completed and it's now going to open, and they want to publish a travel guide, but they want to avoid the dryness of the Baedeker style travel guide, and that's why they hope to have some writers of travelogues. So that's apparently everything that's and then for the tour, So in the announcements of the tour, they said, so they would have information, kind of small displays on local produce, on road safety, and on sites of touristic interests. So for example, for the Tiger Hill in Suzhou, they would have a kind of, you know, information display on Tiger Hill, and then they would have the locals maybe give the opportunity to promote or sell local produce, and road safety was also an issue. And besides that, I haven't seen anything about, you know, overtly political regulation. So it was really about going there together, taking in the beautiful scenery, and then writing something that attracts more travelers and more. Now I remember what your first question was. It was about the editors. So one editor was was Zhao Shuyong, who was the editor of the China Traveler of 旅行杂志. And the other editor was a member of the Hangzhou Reconstruction Bureau. So it was really the political sphere and the travel sphere cooperating in putting together this book. And then it had a huge board of editors, or probably rather a board of advisors. And there we have senior politicians like Ye Gongzhuo and Huang Yanpei, and we have Huang Binhong, Yu Jianhua, we have Lin Yutang, we have the editorial board of Shidai, of the journal Shidai. So we have really something like a who's who of senior politicians and people from the Shanghai media sphere and artists who are kind of involved in the editing of Dongnan Lanzheng. So, but how exactly they, I haven't seen any, you know, yeah, but I only know the name. So who actually did what is not so clear. So there's a very brief text from the editor from the Reconstruction Bureau, who writes about the scientific travelogues that he included. So the one on geography, actually, the text by He Tianjian also goes under scientific travelogue. Then one on medicinal plants, and two on the history of Huangshan. So He Tianjian's and Huang Binhong's articles for Dongnan Lanzheng are all scientific travelogues. So this is apparently comes from the aim to include a scholarly perspective on the region, but a scholarly perspective that is always linked to travel and to the appreciation of landscape beauty. Also, no practical information. There's no practical information included. But there's advertisements. So there's advertisements for Kodak and Agfa and these, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. So I can see that there is a question from an audience called Fang Xiaoya. The question is, Yu Jianhua's handwritten and hand-painted manuscript seems to be limited to a private sphere nearer to literati practice, whereas other publications you mentioned were visible to a larger audience. Did you recognize any differences between these two kinds of productions by the same author? Thank you.
No, astonishingly, no. So although he just had, because there were these unique originals and he kept them by himself, but they're written as if they are addressing a larger audience. So this is something I cannot really explain, but you can't, they're not written differently from, for example, his Yandangshan travelogue that he published in the China Traveler. So it's actually, it seems like they're a continuation of his earlier publication activities, but I mean, in any form of publication would compromise the visual quality. So there would be no way to reproduce all the color illustrations in color at that time. So it was actually, it was only reproduced in 2008. So he painted the fourth one in 1942 of Wu Yishan. And so there's 4 of them in total, and they were fully reproduced in publication in 2008, I think. So they're available now.
All right, we encourage audience to type your question in the chat box, or even raise your hand so that we can unmute you. You can talk to the speaker directly if that's your preference. Just let us know. So I have a quick question. So you mentioned that the catalog Dongnan Lansheng was very expensive to produce, right? So do you have an idea how many copy was printed, and then who were some of the targeted audience? If the number is very limited, what's the purpose of, would there be any other purposes of grouping together such a diverse groups of cultural producers together?
Yeah, I haven't looked at the print run, so I can't answer that. But I think it's I think that the audience was really, I imagine it sort of, I mean, because I can compare it with the Huangshan Lansheng, which was just about 1/10 of the price. So it's really, Huangshan Lansheng is it's a very thin booklet. It's just a paperback, and it's maybe this small. So letter, how do you say, letter size sort of, and it contains practical information. So this is more or less something you could really take along on your travels to Huangshan. And Dongnan Lansheng is about this big, and it's hardcover, and it's very well printed, and was just so I think it was really something that was produced for appreciation at home, not to take along as a travel guide or something. So it was maybe more something like a collectible or a gift by government authorities to businessmen. And so I imagine that would rather be the purpose. But they did advertise it. So they made advertisement, and they advertised that it took extremely long to produce, and that it was extremely expensive to produce. So that was their advertisement. We used 1 year and spent tens of thousands of yuan to produce this book. That was the slogan for advertising the book.
Yeah, that sounds very costly, really, to produce. So do you have an idea where this model of catalog?
Sorry, can I ask a question, because we're running out of time?
Okay, I just want to finish my question very quick. Okay, where did that model come from? The model of putting together painter, photographer, and write it together.
Actually, I think it's unique for this book. So it's also, because it's also several sections. So it's actually, so each chapter could be taken out actually, and because so you have the section for each highway or railroad, and then you have a title calligraphy written by different personalities. And then you also can see that the groups are different. So the people who traveled along the routes differ, and also the way so in some the ratio of images and poems is high, and in others it's more text. So it's kind of, each chapter has its own character as well. So I think I haven't found a similar arrangement. So I think it's really kind of a new interpretation of pre-modern travel literature. because it seems to be so conservative, but then it's kind of transforming this conservative. So it's all classical poetry. It's all many texts written in classical Chinese. So it's kind of a modern arrangement of traditional formats. Yeah, but Pan, you wanted to.
Yeah, because looking at this slide, it really reminds me of these similar patterns of even the arrangement of these images in the 50s. Renminhua Bao, and they are actually propagating a lot of infrastructure images side by side with landscape images, mainly, of course, photographs. So because I might miss something. I remember there were images about bridges, but do you see there is
this one? This one is a bridge.
Yes,
okay.
yes, this
Oh,
bridge.
sorry.
Yeah, and so, but I'm wondering if you see any of this kind of similar tendency of merging this infrastructure into the nature, as if these modern, railway and all these kind of mechanical artifacts also become a kind of nature. Yeah.
Yeah, very seldomly. I mean, that's really what struck me when I first started thinking about this. I mean, this is from Liang You. This is Liang You Zazhi. This
Right.
is not. This is from the pictorial. So therefore, it looks, of course, more similar to Renminhua Bao, because it's kind of, you could say it's a continuation, maybe, but for let me go back to where we can see Dongnan Lansheng, which I mean, here we have 2 pages from Dongnan Lansheng. So it's really the absence of infrastructure is really what is striking. So this whole book is about infrastructure, but there's practically no, I mean, there's 2 or 3 images where you can see a car. And there's a bit more of it in China as she is, but also not a lot. So it seems that and there was, so there's a parallel publication to the 1933. So 1933, this first railway anthology where Yu Dafu initially published his text. There's a parallel publication on the construction of the railway, which is about construction. So you have all the information on the engineering, and there you have photographs of Lietre, so of locomotives, of trains rushing along the tracks, and of the tracks of the railroad tracks, and also of bridges in construction, and the first train crossing a bridge. But these photographs, that's kind of which one would expect, just thinking also about early American photography and railroad photography and travel photography, that this would be included in such a book. It's all in the railroad construction counterpart. Right. So there's the separation of aesthetic appreciation and modernization, which then maybe we could say after 1949 merges more straightforwardly into this very very positive evaluation of this technological
development
and vanquishing of nature. So, overcoming nature becomes more important than nature appreciation, which I mean, is basically the translation of or a reinvention of literati aesthetics for the modern reader. And this is something that wouldn't be appropriate for a socialist audience.
So this might be like a transitional period of time from the painting as media and to photography and to the next stage.